Created in 2005 and hosted by security industry veterans, Paul Security Weekly is your source for in-depth coverage of the latest vulnerabilities, exploits, and security research. Our weekly security news discussion dives deep into the security issues we face today and potential solutions in a fun and lively atmosphere. Each week, we bring on guests from the security community to learn about their journey and discuss topics relevant to their work and research. You can also subscribe to our show by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe or look for Paul Security Weekly in your favorite podcast catcher. We've recorded a ton of content over the years, so we created Spotify playlists featuring some of our favorite episodes, including interviews with Marcus Random, John McAfee, and Chris Roberts, to name a few. You can find them at securityweekly.com/starter packs.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Scott Piper about crafting guardrails in the cloud, pushing for security changes at CSPs, and ratcheting security to reduce legacy cloud configurations. I'm your host, Mike Shima, in an alliterative mood, and I'm here with John Kinsella, we'll find out what mood he's in, John, because we've got some vulns, we've got some bad practices to talk about. I'm not sure if we're going to make you cranky or happy. We'll see.
It's not going to be an alliterative. It's definitely not going to be that.
Tongue twister time. All right, I'll give you a chance to recover your speaking ability. We'll see how I can do, because I wanted to talk about something that Scott actually helpfully mentioned without realizing it in our interview, which was a great interview. Please, everyone, go listen. JSON, JSON, and parsing thereof. I have two themes this week. One is parsing, one is RFCs. So we'll see which one puts people to sleep first. But in JSON, Scott was mentioning that if you come across your dictionary and you have two identical keys with different values, what do you do? And let's actually put John Kinsella on the spot. Either, John, if you were a parser and I gave you two keys, same keys with two different values, what would you do?
I'm thinking like some of them. I'd read the first one, I'd save that value. I'd read the second one, I'd overwrite the first one's value. And
who knows if that's correct? Well, that's correct in the John Kinsella parsing mechanism.
In a perfect world, if we're really going to fantasize, I might throw an error message or a log saying, "Hey, I've seen this already," but don't need to worry about that. That's extra code.
Well, I wasn't sure how dangerous that was going to be to ask a question, because I was worried about a GTFO in response there. But yes, you mentioned, why not throw an error, throw an exception, because that's a bit weird. But this first article I have here is attacking APIs through JSON injection, and it's actually about a little Samsung device. Who cares? Because the article itself is much better just talking about parsers, and it points out that the RFC for the JSON format is kind of ambiguous. It doesn't really say, should you take the first value if you have duplicate keys, or should you take the second one? Should you append them? And we've even you can play around with this in non-JSON environments too. We had this thing called, HTTP parameter pollution, which was big for a while, for a year or two at Black Hat, and then kind of the name went away. But it's the idea of, here's even a URL parameter, and you put the URL parameter twice, or just duplicate it a few times in that URL, but give it different values and just see what's going to happen. Are you going to be polite, take the first one, overwrite? Are you going to take the second one, throw away the first one? Are you going to append them or do other strange things? Because as John's kind of hesitation pointed out very helpfully, what should you do? It's often helpful to have a standard that says this. And here I'm getting to beat the dead horse now. The standard is ambiguous, and I want to pull a couple other articles in on this theme and what the consequences are, but I don't want to have to be the only one talking here, John. So let me throw it over to you.
So the you mentioned the URL parameters. I'm pretty sure, if I remember right, PHP or one of those guys, if they sees it more than once, it'll turn into an array.
Yes.
And that sounds like that's also a cool answer if you're expecting it. Because if you're not expecting it, suddenly you think you're going to be having a single typed variable in it. Hey, surprise, it's an array. I guess that might work in C, but that's either way, you hit it at the end when you said it's if you're going to, that's a weakness in the spec as far as I'm concerned.
Yes.
So, yeah, I don't know. This JSON thing, it's done as well for a few years, but it feels like it's starting to get near the end of its lifetime. I mean, and that's a very relative thing since we haven't got rid of XML yet. But I don't know. It did as well for many years, but I have the feeling that we're seeing more and more of these sort of cracks in it. I guess as people are focusing on it more and sort of poking more at the bear.
Absolutely. And even in that article, it did mention there is also binary JSON. There's a couple alternatives too that are other encapsulations, but it's sort of, you have to get everybody to agree. And everybody also still uses XML, and there's a lot of people out there who love their YAML. And it was even last week, I think, that we talked about a YAML parser that was using JSON on the internal marshalling and then writing it back to YAML. So we'll try not to break John's brain again this week. But I did have a couple. There was another article I had that was actually from August, but it was just updated this week because Gareth Hayes, good old Portswigger, posted his presentation from DEF CON about splitting the email atom, which again is talking about parsing. And so in this case, rather than talking about parsing JSON, it's parsing email addresses. And John, I don't know when the last time you tried writing a regex, but there is this classic situation of how do you write a regex to parse an email address? And some examples are spectacularly long. You can get into 1,000 to 2,000 character range. I think the shortest I've seen that's quote unquote most correct is at least 500 characters, which is, it looks like hieroglyphics. It's inscrutable. But part of the reason I wanted to highlight this, because Portswigger does fun work, but it also pointed to the RFC, which even and another blog that just explains why there's ambiguity and there's difficulty in the email address spec that makes it hard to have a really good, just simple, universal parser for this. And it's these parsing inconsistencies that create that surprise. And from that surprise comes security vulnerabilities and really fun security presentations. So, yeah, John, I don't know if you've been trying to write a regex in the background, but...
Still try to parse what you just said. I'm just sort of thinking through, and yeah, it's the one that always sticks in my head in the back of I think it's in the back of the Safari regex book. They've got a version of a regex, and I think it might be over a page long. It's brutal.
Crazy.
But think about the reason why this exists, right? So modern email addresses came from way older school things, which were out there, and they wanted to have some sort of backward compatibility. And in some ways now we're actually, the major email providers are using some of those old features as a hack. Old hacks as a feature, right? Like the plus in an email address. If you want multiple Gmail or whoever your email address, put like a plus and whatever else in there. But I think I'd file this one underneath, and I don't know how at this point we do it, but I would like to think one of the better ways to do this is hit the eject button and start over. It's sort of similar to when do you get rid of the old 8-bit x86 instructions. But it's right. It sounds wonderful. Let's live in that dreamland for about 4 or 5 seconds, and then realize it's probably not going to happen. They're so ubiquitous. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, maybe there's something here with passkeys. Maybe somehow bring those two together for authentication. And in other words, what I'm saying is, I'm not using that I'm saying if you can have a standard like that where you're just giving someone a passkey versus this is my identity, would that make this? Would that provide us a path to come up with a new standard, a new way of doing this? I don't know. We can start using our PGP IDs instead. I mean, that's easy, right?
Just don't propose those ASN.1 parsers, because man, if there was ever a place that was rife with security vulns, talk about another underspecified and ambiguous spec, right?
This post just keeps going. It's a horrible thing.
Wonderful, horrible thing, exactly. You set up some good segues to some other articles, but before we go there, so bear with me, I did want to pull in, so we just talked about email and parsing. I started off with that JSON and parsing, and these were problems with the specs that you helpfully pointed out were just underspecified, that the problem was in the spec. And so it's sort of like, if I'm going to implement this, how do I do this? And it's those differences in implementations that cause problems. I pulled in another article that was about a DTLS clientele race condition in WebRTC implementations. And this was fine. There's WebRTC in there. It does talk about JSON parsing as well. But it pointed out two sentences that stood out to me is that they found a DOS. They were able to muck about with the UDP packets and how the hellos are coming and basically spoof hellos or interject hellos. But they quote, the behavior discussed in this paper does not imply a bug that exists in the specification. So this is good. This is where the specification actually covered a lot of these things. However, they continue, it highlights a gap that multiple implementers have failed to identify checking the origins of this DTLS client hello. So we can hand wave a little bit about what the protocol actually is and just more about, there's UDP packets. UDP packets are much easier to spoof. You do need some client integrity authentication, and implementers they discovered were not doing this consistently. And consistency brings insecurity. There's my alliteration and a tongue twister all at once. I just wanted to kind of to show both sides of the coin there, if you will. We have a inadequate design that really causes headaches for implementers, and then we can call it an adequate design that implementers still don't adhere to. So we're going to be covering the news for quite a while, I guess, is the only summary I can have there.
I was just thinking, I don't know if this is a good idea or bad, or if I'm AI whitewashing, but as we sort of wrapped up that last article and you talk about this one, I'm wondering, I wonder if someone's done this. I'm sure somebody has. If you take one of these specs, throw it in an LLM, and say, hey, tell me where the weaknesses are, what would it do with that?
We had, you triggered my memory. We covered maybe a year or two ago, someone had taken a RFC text spec, thrown it into an LLM to generate a fuzzer for it. So we'll have to go dig that project out and see, did that go from just a conference presentation into a long-term extended project? Because that just triggered a good light bulb. So there we go. I've got some homework this week. Nothing for John, nothing for listeners. So I appreciate that. So John, in the spirit of appreciating what you're bringing to the episode here, could we write some of these parsers in safe C++? There's a proposal out there to maybe I'll have to revisit my jokes about making fun of software written in C and C++.
Excuse me, and I haven't read the whole thing yet because it's words, lots of words.
Lots of words.
But yeah, so this came out, and we've been talking about, there's been mumblings and sort of, fist shaking from the C++ community for a while now. And they've now come out with a proposal for an enhancement to the language, which they're calling Safe C++. And this it's an interesting read. That they've definitely put some thought into it. One of the thoughts that they put into it seems to be a lot of copying, pasting from, maybe not copying, pasting, but borrowing ideas from Rust. So Rust is mentioned over 50 times in this document, which, it's a good thing in a way, right? So I think, so the two themes for me on this story is one, just sort of, how they lay it out, sort of interesting. I could go look at my show notes, but just sort of going up here, one of the things that caught my eye was how they start off by saying, hey, these are the categories of safety which we're going to think about. So we're going to break it down into lifetime safety, type safety. If I scroll down here a little further, thread safety, and then I think it's runtime security or runtime checks. So it's what they're sort of proposing. There's a ton of examples in here, both of code as well as the compiler errors which they throw. So they're looking at a lot of this, same as Rust, from a compiler compile time warning or catching up these issues, and then also sort of decorating the language with safety tags or unsafe or things like that. I've soaked up about half the doc. I want to go through and read a little more closely. I think, you were saying you've written more C++ than Rust. I've been looking at more Rust this year, but I've been writing a lot of anything. But I'm curious to sort of see how I want to first think how would this affect what I think of C++? More or less or the same, or is it just going to change my opinion of it in general? How's this going to affect Rust over the next 18, 24 months? Or people who are thinking about going over to this new language with a learning curve, are they going to instead say, hey, let's just focus on what we've got? And then, like, I don't know. I think one of the things I was thinking about, Mike, is it's, as you who's written and used C++, would this make you, with your security person hat on, would this make you go to a development team and say, this new project you're working on, do you write it in Rust or do you write it in safe C++? Or, how does that affect what's going on either with an individual team or with a company?
Yeah, and I think the first answer is, even with the safe C++, you still got that learning curve. And because that learning curve comes from, are we using the C++ 11, C++ 17, already the C++ 23? Which extensions are we using here? And hopefully we're using a modern compiler that can support it, et cetera. But this doesn't come for free in the sense of it's just the same C++. You actually there are new patterns to follow, et cetera. And even, I like to point out that C++ 11 did some great things, in my opinion, with like safe pointers, smart pointers, I should say, so that you could have just some easy encapsulation, some lifetime of here's how the pointer is going to get auto deleted on when the destructor calls, et cetera, et cetera. But it also introduced an auto pointer that they actually then went back and removed. So I'm pointing that out is that the language is trying to become more secure, trying to become more developer friendly, but it's still hitting a couple of edge cases where the developer experience isn't quite right. It's misusing or it's not quite being as safe as it could be. I guess the other way I'd answer this too is that I do like that they introduced threads, basically a thread library into C++ as well. So you don't have to go into the local P threads or whatever Windows handles things. So that's where I don't know anything at all. But just not having to worry about that P thread join and figuring all that out, you can just have this as kind of that C++ object lifetime. So that's my answer coming from that experience, that this feels like some natural ways that make the developer experience easier without adding a whole bunch more angle brackets and parentheses and making the code be more unreadable. Because if that was the case and this was huge complex templates and the template debugging becomes pages and pages of errors, that's a nightmare. And that's where I'd say, give me something where that has kind of the pretty error feedback of Rust, and I'll throw in Go for that matter too. They've actually have done a lot of surveys just asking the community, what do you want? And a lot of those responses have better debugging, better error handling. So I've kind of taken your answer and turned it into just what makes the developer more efficient. And it's a little bit, I'm thinking back to how Simon answered a similar question too, when he was talking about Java versus Rust for that matter.
As I'm looking through their examples, besides just the learning curve, what I'm concerned about, I want to get a better understanding. It feels like there's a lot of decoration going on in here, and that this is their example, so maybe that's the case. But my point being, if you have to go through and decorate all of your code, Rust doesn't do that, right? I mean, the biggest one that comes to my mind is unsafe. But like, if I have to specify in every either function definition or some of the other things in here, it's like that. At that point, all I have to do is forget putting the word safe in, and now am I unsafe? So that's sort of I don't know. I'm sure, again, a compiler and IDE could deal with that, but it doesn't feel right. And
it feels, I guess that also makes me think, that doesn't necessarily feel like it's going to help legacy code either. I don't think you can go back with a C code base and start to decorate it to improve things. That's going to be a rewrite. And that goes back to that question, do we start from scratch with this safe C++, or do we just go with that Rust approach? So
I mean, they're not even using the standard. Well, standard library still exists, but they now got STD2. So it looks like they're putting a lot of the safe stuff is in there. So now you have to make sure you're using the right STD. I had that thought as well around legacy code. It's there'd definitely be work to do. I mean, maybe you do the same thing we've talked about with Rust, where you say, hey, let's just focus on making the parts we care about safe and secure instead of rewriting.
I think overall I can keep making fun of C and C++, so I'm going to keep doing that. The other group making fun, I'm not alone here, because CISA is on a roll. They've been talking about memory safe languages for a long time, trying to go into Go and Rust. They talk about secure default, secure design, and now They have guidance, John, about bad practices. So if you wanted to do a bad practice, you can get guidance that's government approved.
Perfect. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
You know what I'm also looking for is, I'm not, but the OWASP top 10. How are these things different?
And that was one of the things I was starting to, that was my first thing. Like, are they just using synonyms for the OWASP top 10 categories? And it's not quite. So that's a good thing, but it does point out things like there should be, implement MFA, do input validation, a lot of those standard things. They talk about more explicitly output encoding. But a lot of it, for me, still boils down to that idea of, John, here's a list of things don't do. Now, go write some code and don't do these things. Mm-hmm. But it's sort of like, well, okay, what should you do, right? I haven't really given you any helpful guidance other than like, don't make mistakes. So please don't make any mistakes.
I just figured it out. This is the OWASP top 10 for product security bad practices.
Yes. And there is what is it called? There is a top 10 project called the OWASP top 10 proactive controls that basically is an inversion of the top 10 list, that rather than saying, don't do command injection, it says, here's how to separate data and code. So there's still some things to talk about there, I think, in the future, but I'm trying to, I personally am always trying to tease out something meaty and actionable for
just to spend
developers.
10-ish seconds more on this. Mm-hmm. So I'm trying to think through, like, seriously, like, who's going to use this? And it's going towards the Federal Register. So this is, in the U.S., if you're, I'm guessing, working with government agencies, they're going to want to see that you pay attention to this. But the interesting question why I mentioned that is, for whoever this is that's using this, and I'm sure there's valid reasons, valid use cases out there, that means, does that mean that they were not already using something like OWASP? Is this like the first time, or is this standardization across a bunch of different orgs? Or, in other words, what is it? It was there not something there before? How is that being used? So that's.
I do wonder that. That's an interesting question. Maybe pure conjecture here, but we're podcasters, so why not? This is the idea of, so you're writing software for the government and say, we're not following the bad practices, but we're avoiding the bad practices, obviously, or pointing out to CWEs, because one of the things that stands out to me, CISA loves to talk about CWEs, and there's a ton of CWEs referencing these bad practices. Which, on the one hand, okay, we've been tracking CWEs. I think if I can throw my historian hat on, since 2005-ish, for example, when we had them as a taxonomy, but obviously they cover vulnerabilities, problems that predate 2005, well back deep into the history of Unix. But I don't know, other than me remembering CWE 22, because it has to do with file traversal, I don't know anybody who really talks about CWEs or uses CWEs in a general case, like CVEs, obviously, but is there something, should we start talking on the show here about CWEs, John? Like, what's the story here?
That's an interesting. So I know from previous lifetimes, there's certain large organizations which I've worked with, large enterprises, they have adopted using CWEs to sort of define, what are they looking for, sort of from a threat model, or overall, how are they looking to run their security practices? These are the CWEs we care about. And what I've seen in those orgs that have adopted those, they really drank that Kool-Aid. They were really into it. One of them actually wanted me to modify one of my software packages to start talking CWE. So yeah, they were really.
Wow. Okay.
I think what I'd say is I sort of look through the doc. If you're an organization that uses phrases like the digital kill chain, then there's a pretty good chance you're going to be playing with CWE. So in other words, someone who is, I don't want to say like high risk or what, but they're like, it's an organization that has, you've really adopted that sort of information war theater, info war theater. I'm forgetting my commands, but like my commands, my phrases. If you're in some of those places where it probably isn't as saying originally working with the government, then there's a chance of it, I think. But I think I don't know, listeners, let us know. Or do you love, hate CWEs? Is it something you use every day? I'd be really curious to sort of see more about what when and where and why.
We'd love to hear what are those use cases and what's the value you're getting out of that, or what's the change that you're able to trigger using them. And in the spirit of CWEs, I have no idea what these would fall under, so I have to admit that up front. But John, you had 2 other articles about some vulnerabilities. One looks like I know there's a default credentials CWE and a local privilege escalation CWE out there somewhere. But while I look them up or try to look them up, tell us about these articles.
I'll hit the second one first. This is Trend Micro, and I just sort of had to put this in here there because so they've patched actually a collection of issues recently, but the one that sort of jumped up and bit me in their the Trend Micro agent, deep security agent. There's improper access control, which results in a local privilege escalation from your security tool. On Windows systems, and it's one of those, come on now. You sort of I've got no idea about trend or what's going on or what looks like internally, but I do start wondering, do you have a modern AppSec program? Are you testing these things before you put them to before you release them out, or is there a pen tester going after them? I mean, it's trend. They're not small, so I imagine they're doing these things and it just didn't get caught. Was this new code or was it old code, or all those questions start bouncing around my head. But I think what sort of irks me a little bit, they've got a few of the stories we looked at this week, or at least I looked at, are now having mitigating factors as part of their, it seems more so than previously in their part of their announcement. And on this one, they're like, exploiting these types of vulnerabilities generally require that an attacker has access to a vulnerable machine. In addition to timely application of patches and updated solutions, customers are also advised to review remote access to their critical systems and ensure policies and perimeter security is up to date. Really? Thanks. That feels a little bit like you're making excuses, guys. Come on. But anyways, that's one. I'm going to keep going. The Kubernetes one is sort of interesting. So Kubernetes has something called a Kubernetes image builder project. And the idea here is, if you're deploying Kubernetes at scale or larger, medium scale, you don't want to be like installing an OS in each box, then installing the cube bits, and then the things on top of that, and blah, blah, right? It's what these guys allow you to do is create a VM image, and you fling that image at your either on-prem or a cloud provider of your choice, and there you go. You've got a bunch of nodes you can spin up pretty quickly. Unfortunately, the image builder was using default credentials. So depending on where you're using this is sort of a little bit interesting about it. Depending on which provider you're using to build those images, so either Proxmox, which is an open source, what do you call it? It's not sort of a, I'll call it a virtualization management package, right? It still uses QEMU and things underneath the hood, or Nutanix, another commercial one out there. There's different results of this. So with Proxmox, if you're using the Proxmox provider, this comes out as CBSS 9.8, and you've got some pretty tasty remote execution capabilities through SSH. If you're using Nutanix, however, they've got things on their side, it's only 6.3, so still an issue, but it's interesting to see how different implementations or different providers that are using that sort of have different results. They did mention in this article they must have providers for the cloud providers. I don't know if they're more or less what's going on there. That might be interesting to see. But yeah, so this is now fixed. If you're using Kubernetes and you're using the image builder, it's time to update that. But thought that was sort of an interesting one.
The only thing I can add is that's CWE 1392, use of default credentials. So maybe we actually need to have some like named CWEs so we can remember these. And this is, I don't have a good name here, but maybe that's the project. Somebody out there wants to create a name generator for CWEs.
All 1,300 plus of them.
Oh yeah, there's a few. Speaking of things that are, how do I introduce this? John, we talked about actually some Perl and PHP earlier this month. I just wanted to use as examples of legacy code and modern code and how do you like secure both. So Perl was legacy, PHP was modern, but PHP definitely straddles the modern and old. And PHP is a lot of WordPress. WordPress, we kind of don't cover those vulns very often because there seems to be every week there's some WordPress plugin that has a vulnerability, whereas the WordPress core doesn't. But there is quite the brouhaha from 404 Media one of my news resources that I quite enjoy following, they have a good summary of what WordPress.org, WordPress.com, and WP Engine are doing. And what this is, if I can try to do this in 60 seconds, WordPress.com basically said, in general, we have this security policy that if there's a known vulnerability that's critical, that has a worrisome severity, and it doesn't get fixed, we're going to take ownership of that for the good of the community, fix that vulnerability, and keep that plugin going so that all of our users can stay secure. In principle, that seems relatively reasonable. It's going to take care of things that get lost, that are just the developer has gone away. These are orphaned types of plugins. However, it gets weaponized when a plugin owned by WP Engine had a vulnerability report against it. WordPress, I'll use the phrase collusion with WordPress.com. There's some back-end shenanigans is maybe the way they'll get me less in trouble. Basically disabled WP Engine's access to be able to update their plugin. And then said, now we're getting to the cynical world of, oh, look, it's been a month, you haven't updated the security problem. We're going to take this over for the good of the community, apply a fix, and push it out to all of our users. So what the vulnerability was doesn't really matter. How this was weaponized and how this was, I think it's quite fair to say, abused is very worrisome, as well as kind of interesting from an AppSec perspective. And it speaks to that idea of, in my mind, I was thinking of Polyfill, that Polyfill.io was bought by some new owners, and those new owners snuck in some links. And that's a surprise that you don't want to have in your supply chain. In this case, this was ostensibly done for security reasons. It was done transparently, but it has really bad consequences, both for users of this plugin, because the plugin name got changed, as well as the owners of the plugin who say, we still own this. We're still supporting this. So I don't think I made my 60-second limit, but it's quite a lot of craziness going on there in the WordPress world.
Yeah. I don't have a ton to add here. I've known of WP Engine for ages. I think of them as expensive WordPress hosting, but they were always, at least, it wasn't expensive overprices. Like, you got what you paid for is what my understanding was. It was more similar to WordPress Enterprise, WordPress. There's another level of WordPress. It might be off the .com, but it's not just here's your blog. It's if you want to, I think Andreas and I know some of the VCs use it. Let's put it that way. So it's more you want to make sure your stuff stays up and running and all that type of stuff. But yeah, it's unfortunate to see this. I mean, just looking through. So we offered employees who didn't want to believe. So the CEO offered employees who they weren't convinced this was the right way to go and they didn't like this drama. Here's $30,000. Have a nice day. Don't come back. Which we've seen some other companies do that over the last year or two, and it's never really. It's okay for an executive or a founder to be opinionated and have sort of do what they want to do, be polarizing. But at the same time, for an existing company, when people have been there and working and stuff, it feels a little, it seems like there should be a better way. I realize the irony in me saying that right now. But yeah, what else you got?
I got something really quick talking about protocols, as I love to do. I have a very brief article from Reflections on TPAC 2024 Breakouts. This is basically a blog post from the W3C, which is responsible for many of the things like HTML and even XML, I believe. One of your favorites, perhaps? I add with a question mark, John. But they're talking about just what were the discussions this year about what are people within the W3C working on. And they have things like wallets. There's web apps in general, but I think that's closer to things like WASM, for example. Permissions, the real-time web, that's similar to the WebRTC, perhaps, that we covered already. There's identity, that speaks quite directly, I think, to your idea, what you were alluding to earlier about email addresses and identity, passkeys, for example. And AI is on that list as well, of course, which I'm really hoping that stands for AppSec involved, AppSec implementation, but I suspect it's the other two letters, or other two words that AI stands for. But I thought I'd throw that in just for anyone who wants to kind of look for areas of research to get in early on to see what new standards, what new protocols might be coming to then have your own Gareth Hayes style DEF CON presentation in the next year or two.
It's this one I think is for someone you either, as you mentioned, you want to sort of dive in and learn and sort of help contribute at that low level, or you're going to be like, no, I'm not going to that. I'm just browsing the talks as you were doing. One is on HTML model elements discussion. I'm like, what are the good ones do we have in here? Using LinkML in the web of things specifications. I mean, all these sound very dry, and I'm making a little bit of fun of them. Sharing styles with decorative shadow DOM. But like if you are in that space or working at like low level detail, some of these I'm imagining were actually quite active conversations, which is, it's good in a way, right? Because I think for a lot of us who we've done web development, and you're like, what in God's name with this, like, you see the page, if there's a website out there which shows you which HTML components or JavaScript are available in which browser. Yeah, right. And you're like, wow, what's going on here? And it's because you need to get more active in conversations like this to actually either understand or help get people to understand why this needs to be easier or more standardized. So it sounds dry, as I said at the beginning, but fairly popular.
Fairly popular. And I think I threw in two other quick, just kind of FYI, if you will, articles. One about a link from the OpenSSF to a free developing secure software course, which I haven't taken myself yet. So that's my second homework for this week, to go check it out and see how good of a recommendation I would give for doing that. And then another thing about passkeys, as well as honestly an article from Amazon that's just showing the positive impact of passkeys in the sense of adoption, getting people to use stronger authentication that is phishing resistant. So I think I personally probably will keep repeating passkeys with joy for quite a while until people start using it, because CISA, we've got government backing. CISA wants people to do that as well, or have phishing resistant MFA as well. So that's what I've got. John, anything else you want to wrap us up this week with?
It'd be fun to have mentioned the Amazon passkeys during our interview, from the point of view of how does that manage or deal. I've been starting to use passkeys. I'm adopting them slowly over this year. I'm sure there's at least one web property out there where I've got two separate passkeys. But I'm sort of thinking again through if you're like logging into AWS console or even just Amazon.com. Well, probably on Amazon.com, I have one, maybe two accounts. But for AWS, it's very common to have hundreds of thousands, as we were saying. How does that work with passkeys? It probably doesn't, right? But what does that actually? It'd be interesting to think through that for a few minutes and see how that works. There was something I saw in the last few days. I didn't put it in, but someone's working on. It sounds like the standard for passkeys is becoming more as it becomes more adopted. They're starting to think about sharing passkeys between devices more and stuff. Some of the things I was worried about earlier. So yeah, cool to see that grow and continue to do its thing. Beside that, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, we'll see, that more interoperability. So good points from Mr. Kinsella, as always. So I want to say thank you once again, John, for helping me talk through the news.
Thanks for putting up with me.
I want to say thank you to Kalyani, who also joined us for the interview for the first segment, and everyone who's been listening to us talk about the news. Thank you for joining us. Please remember to subscribe, share on the socials, check out the show notes. And speaking of parsing things, check out The Devil's Kitchen by Vincenzo Salvia. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.